Admiral Quilbert Flappingworth was having what could generously be described as the worst possible day to give a speech about galactic efficiency. His tentacles were tangled in the ceremonial ribbons. His third eye had developed an unfortunate twitch, and worst of all, he'd just discovered that Earth, had been missing from the official galactic registry for exactly 523 years, 4 months, 16 days, and approximately 14 minutes. The discovery had come about in the most bureaucratically embarrassing way possible. While reviewing the quarterly efficiency reports, which themselves required efficiency reports about their efficiency, Quilbert's assistant had noticed a peculiar gap in the filing system. Not a small gap, not even a medium-sized gap, a gap large enough to fit an entire solar system, complete with one moderately inhabited planet that had somehow been sending them radio signals for the better part of a century. Distinguished colleagues of the Intergalactic Council of Supremely Important Administrative Decisions. Quilbert's voice echoed through the crystalline amphitheater where 47 different species sat in neat rows, all desperately trying to look like they understood what was happening. The amphitheater itself was a monument to bureaucratic excess, designed by a committee of 17 different architects who had never actually met, but had exchanged approximately 4,000 memos about the proper curvature of administrative seating. Today marks our most momentous bureaucratic achievement, the completion of Form GX9847B, subsection J, paragraph 4.7.28. Regarding the standardization of planetary classification procedures across all 732 registered galactic sectors. The audience made polite clicking, humming, and what might have been applause from species whose anatomy didn't quite support traditional clapping. Some of them made sounds that could have been enthusiastic, if enthusiasm was defined as the noise a filing cabinet makes when it falls down a very long flight of stairs. Quilbert's assistant, a nervous creature named Bimpleton Worrywisk, who looked like a cross between a nervous accountant and an anxiety-ridden octopus having an identity crisis, shuffled through a stack of papers that stood roughly 3 feet high and was held together with what appeared to be pure administrative determination. Bimpleton had been with the council for approximately 200 years, during which time he had never once successfully completed a task without discovering that it required the completion of at least 17 other tasks first. He was, by all accounts, the perfect bureaucratic assistant, thoroughly overwhelmed, completely dedicated, and entirely convinced that somewhere in the vast maze of procedures and protocols lay a system that actually made sense. "Sir?" Bimpleton whispered urgently, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had just discovered that the foundation of reality was actually built on quicksand and paperwork. "There's been a slight irregularity in the filing system." "Not now, Worrywisk," Quilbert hissed back, his ceremonial hat slipping askew in a way that would have been undignified if dignity hadn't been buried under several tons of administrative procedure decades ago. "I'm about to announce the most comprehensive planetary audit in galactic history. Every single inhabited world has been properly categorized, documented, cross-referenced, sub-categorized, and assigned an appropriate bureaucratic classification number." It was at this precise moment, as these moments always are in the universe's ongoing campaign against anyone who believes they have things properly organized, that the hologram appeared. Not a small hologram. Not a polite, properly scheduled hologram that had filed the correct paperwork in triplicate and waited the appropriate 67 business days for approval. This was a massive, unauthorized, completely regulation-violating hologram that materialized right in the middle of Quilbert's podium, with the subtlety of a supernova at a candle-lighting ceremony and the consideration of an asteroid with diplomatic immunity. The hologram showed a planet, blue and green and white, and absolutely categorically, undeniably not in their database, Not in the primary database, not in the backup database, not in the backup of the backup database, and most disturbing of all, not in the database that tracked things that weren't in the other databases. "What the blazing bureaucratic nightmare is that?" Quilbert shrieked, pointing all four of his arms at the offending celestial image, while his ceremonial hat completed its journey to the floor with a soft thud that somehow managed to sound embarrassed. Before anyone could answer, not that anyone particularly wanted to, as answering questions without first forming a committee to discuss the proper format for answers was considered rather rude in galactic administrative circles, the hologram flickered and was replaced by something even more disturbing, a human face, not just any human face. This was the face of a middle-aged woman with graying hair, wearing what appeared to be a floral cardigan that looked like it had been designed by someone who had strong opinions about both flowers and comfort. She was holding a cup of tea, in the way that only someone who has thoroughly mastered the art of being calm in the face of absolute chaos can hold a cup of tea. "Oh, hello there," the human said cheerfully, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who has just popped round to borrow a cup of sugar and found herself accidentally addressing the United Nations. "I do hope we're not interrupting anything terribly important. I'm Prudence Kettlesmith, and I represent the planet Earth. We've been listening to your lovely speeches for about 40 years now, and we thought it might be time to introduce ourselves properly." The silence that followed could have been bottled, aged, and sold as a premium vintage of pure, concentrated awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that philosophers would have written extensively about, if philosophers weren't generally too busy arguing about whether silence actually existed or was simply the absence of noise having an identity crisis. Quilbert's jaw dropped so far it nearly hit the floor, which would have been unfortunate as his ceremonial hat was already occupying that particular location. His tentacles went completely limp in a way that would have been medically concerning if there had been any doctors present who specialized in the anatomy of beings whose primary physiological feature was disappointment. His third eye stopped twitching and started spinning like a broken gyroscope that had just been informed its services were no longer required. "You've been—" "What?" he finally managed to croak, his voice climbing several octaves into ranges previously occupied only by species whose communication method involved controlled hysteria. "Listening," Prudence replied brightly, taking a delicate sip of her tea with the sort of casual grace that suggested this was exactly the kind of conversation she had every Tuesday afternoon. "Your broadcasts are quite entertaining, really. We particularly enjoyed last month's 17-hour presentation on proper comma placement in interstellar tax documents. Riveting stuff. We had quite the discussion about it over dinner. This revelation hit the assembly like a meteor made of pure administrative horror. The idea that their carefully crafted presentations on bureaucratic procedure might be considered entertainment was disturbing enough. The notion that beings somewhere were actually having dinner conversations about comma placement threatened the very foundations of their understanding of the universe. Bimpleton Worrywhisk made a sound like a deflating balloon filled with pure anxiety and possibly some helium. "Sir," he whispered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just discovered that everything he believed about reality was actually an elaborate practical joke. "This is the irregularity I was trying to mention. It appears we've somehow misplaced an entire planet." "You don't misplace planets!" Quilbert screamed, his voice reaching levels that would have registered on seismic equipment if seismic equipment were designed to measure bureaucratic earthquakes. "They're enormous. They have gravity, they have weather. They're generally quite difficult to lose track of." "Well," Prudence said reasonably, settling back in what appeared to be a very comfortable chair that definitely hadn't been designed by a committee, "it's not as if you lost us entirely. We've been right here the whole time, third rock from the sun, same solar system for about 4.5 billion years. We're actually quite proud of our consistency in that regard." We've maintained the same orbit, the same rotation, even the same general color scheme. Very reliable planets. The assembled delegates began making various sounds of confusion, alarm, and what might have been intergalactic indigestion. The mixture of sounds created a symphony that could best be described as 47 different species, simultaneously discovering that their understanding of reality had been thoroughly and irreversibly scrambled. The representative from Bloraxia 7, a species that resembled a nervous mushroom with delusions of grandeur and a tendency toward existential dread, stood up on what were probably legs, but might have been very optimistic roots. "This is unprecedented," it squeaked in a voice that suggested it had been practicing that particular declaration in the mirror for several centuries. "How can a planet just exist without proper documentation, without permits, without the appropriate stamps and official seals?" "Oh, we have documentation," Prudence said helpfully, taking another sip of her tea with the air of someone who had anticipated this exact question. "Loads of it, actually. Probably more than you do, if we're being honest. We've been keeping quite detailed records of absolutely everything. Would you like to see?" The hologram shifted again, now displaying what appeared to be a massive filing cabinet, not a digital filing cabinet with elegant holographic interfaces and quantum storage capabilities. This was an actual physical made-of-wood filing cabinet that looked like it had been constructed sometime around the invention of organized confusion and had been maintained through sheer stubbornness and possibly some very good glue. "We've got everything here," Prudence continued, opening one of the drawers with the satisfaction of someone showing off a particularly well-organized sock collection. "Observations of your species, translations of your broadcasts, analysis of your technology, dietary requirements, cultural practices, sleeping patterns, architectural preferences, and a rather comprehensive guide to galactic bureaucracy that we've titled How to Avoid Getting Accidentally Conquered, a Practical Manual for Unauthorized Planets." She paused to retrieve what appeared to be a leather-bound book that looked thick enough to stop a small asteroid. "We've also got a complete breakdown of your governmental structure, efficiency ratings for each department, and some suggestions for improvement. Quite a lot of suggestions, actually." Quilbert felt his career flashing before his eyes. Not his life, his career. The two were remarkably similar, consisting mostly of forms, procedures, meetings about meetings, committees that formed other committees, and a growing sense that the universe was not only uncooperative, but was actively conspiring against anyone who tried to organize it properly. "But you can't just... You need permits," he wailed, his voice cracking with the strain of defending a bureaucratic system that was beginning to look less like a well-oiled machine and more like a very complicated way of ensuring nothing ever got done. "Licenses, official recognition. You need to fill out Form B4499X for initial planetary contact, and that requires 17 different signatures from species you haven't even met yet." The absurdity of this requirement had never actually occurred to him before this moment, but now that he'd said it aloud, it sounded rather like requiring someone to get permission from their future self before being born. "Oh, we tried that," Prudence said conversationally, as if discussing the weather or the proper way to make a sandwich. "But the form rather assumes you know you exist in an official capacity. Quite the philosophical puzzle, really. Rather like asking someone to prove they're asking for permission to ask for permission. We spent several months on that particular logical loop." She gestured toward the filing cabinet again. "It's all documented in section J47. Bureaucratic paradoxes and their practical implications. Fascinating reading, though it did give our philosophers rather terrible headaches." Bimpleton Worrywhisk was frantically searching through the database on his portable administrative device, making increasingly distressed, chittering sounds that suggested he was discovering that everything he thought he knew about reality had been filed under the wrong section. "Sir, according to our records, the Sol system contains 8 planets. Wait, no, 9. No, 8 again. Actually, the number seems to keep changing every time I refresh the database. What do you mean they keep changing? Quilbert demanded, his voice reaching frequencies that were probably illegal in several sectors. Well, Prudence interjected helpfully, setting down her teacup with the care of someone who believed that proper tea service was one of the cornerstones of civilization. We may have made some small adjustments to your database over the years. Nothing major. Just corrected a few astronomical inaccuracies, updated some star charts that were off by several million kilometers, fixed some mathematical errors in your gravitational calculations, that sort of thing. We do hope you don't mind. We're rather fond of precision. The delegate from Whispernook 9, a species that looked like a very worried pencil eraser with abandonment issues, raised what might have been a hand or possibly a specialized pointing appendage. How long have you been adjusting our records? Oh, about 20 years now, Prudence replied cheerfully, as if discussing her hobby of collecting stamps or growing prize-winning vegetables. Ever since we figured out your security protocols. Lovely encryption, by the way, very thorough, but you might want to consider changing your passwords occasionally. Bureaucracy 123, followed by efficiency 456, isn't particularly challenging to crack, especially when you use the same pattern for everything. If Quilbert had possessed human physiology, this would have been the moment for what humans called a heart attack. Since he didn't, he settled for making a sound like a steam engine having an existential crisis while simultaneously questioning all its life choices. Security protocols? Those are classified. They're supposed to be impossible to break. Yes. Well, that's the funny thing about classified information, Prudence said, taking another sip of tea with the philosophical air of someone who had given this matter considerable thought. It's only classified if the people you're classifying it from don't know it exists. We've been rather thorough in our research, actually. Would you like to see our organizational chart of the Galactic Council? We've corrected several errors in the official version and added some flow charts that actually make sense. The hologram now showed what appeared to be a massive flowchart drawn in colored pencils on what looked suspiciously like the back of wallpaper. It was, however, remarkably accurate and considerably more comprehensible than the official version, which had been designed by a committee that had apparently believed that clarity was the enemy of proper procedure. According to our analysis, Prudence continued, consulting what appeared to be a handwritten notebook, your current bureaucratic system has approximately 14,000 redundant procedures, 2,300 forms that require other forms to request permission to fill them out, at least 47 committees whose sole purpose is to form committees to discuss the formation of other committees, and one department whose function nobody can remember but which continues to receive funding, because disbanding it would require forming a committee to study the implications of committee dissolution. The silence that followed this devastating analysis was so profound that it had developed its own postal code and was considering applying for statehood. Bimpleton Worrywhisk looked up from his frantic searching with the expression of someone who had just discovered that not only was the Emperor naked, but that everyone had been politely pretending he was wearing clothes for several centuries. "Sir," he said in a small voice, she's not wrong. Our efficiency rating is approximately 0.003%, and that's only if we count processing paperwork about processing paperwork as actual work." "What? That's impossible," Quilbert spluttered, though even as he said it he was beginning to suspect it might not be. "Actually," Prudence said gently, "we ran the calculations ourselves several times to make sure. Lovely mathematics, by the way. We're rather partial to statistics, especially when they're about efficiency. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't spend 97% of your time filling out forms about the proper procedure for filling out forms." The representative from Grimpleton 4, who resembled a very official pickle with delusions of competence and a tendency toward pompous declarations, stood up stiffly. "This is outrageous. Planets cannot simply..." manage themselves without proper oversight, without regulations, without a properly structured administrative framework. "Oh, we don't manage ourselves," Prudence corrected with the patience of someone explaining something very simple to someone very confused. "We're terrible at that. Wars, pollution, arguing about who left the dishes in the sink, disagreeing about everything from politics to whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Absolute chaos most of the time. But we're rather good at making things work despite the chaos. It's become something of a specialty, really." She gestured, and the hologram changed again, now showing what appeared to be a collection of completely insane contraptions that somehow seemed to function perfectly. Take our space program, for instance. We strapped ourselves to controlled explosions and shot ourselves off our own planet. Worked brilliantly, completely mad from a safety perspective, but remarkably effective. Or our internet, a global communication network that operates primarily through complaints, pictures of small animals, and people arguing about things they don't understand. Remarkably effective for spreading information, even if 90% of it is nonsense. Quilbert was beginning to understand why his species had invented alcohol. Unfortunately, he'd left his emergency flask in his other uniform, the one that didn't have ceremonial ribbons, that served no purpose other than to get tangled at inappropriate moments. But surely you must have some form of government, some official structure, someone officially in charge of making decisions. "Oh, we have loads of people in charge," Prudence replied brightly, as if this were a perfectly normal state of affairs. "The problem is, they can't agree on what they're in charge of, so they spend most of their time arguing with each other, while the rest of us get on with actually doing things. It's a wonderfully efficient system of organized confusion. Nothing gets officially decided, but somehow everything that needs doing eventually gets done by someone." The delegate from Pompington 12, a creature that looked like a worried briefcase with aspirations and anxiety issues, raised what might have been a concern, or possibly just a nervous tic. "But how do you make decisions? How do you implement policy? How do you ensure proper procedures are followed?" "We don't," Prudence said simply, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe. "We just sort of muddle through. Someone has an idea, someone else says it won't work, someone else tries it anyway, and somehow it all manages to function. Rather like evolution, but with more paperwork and considerably less patience. Most of our best ideas come from people who weren't supposed to be working on whatever they ended up solving." Bimpleton Worrywhisk was now making sounds like a malfunctioning printer having an emotional breakdown while simultaneously trying to process a tax return. "Sir, I've been analyzing their approach to problem solving. It appears to be based on what they call making it up as they go along, combined with something they term creative stubbornness, and what they describe as refusing to accept that things are impossible until after they've already done them." "That's madness," Quilbert declared, though he was beginning to wonder if madness might actually be more effective than whatever it was they'd been doing for the past several centuries. "Actually," Prudence said thoughtfully, "it's rather effective. Would you like an example? Your species has been trying to solve the great administrative efficiency crisis for approximately 400 years. You formed 637 committees, subcommittees and sub-subcommittees. You filled out over 2 million forms, held more meetings than there are stars in this sector, and created a bureaucracy so complex that it requires a bureaucracy to understand the bureaucracy. The solution, incidentally, is quite simple. The entire assembly leaned forward with the kind of desperate attention usually reserved for lottery announcements, the location of public restrooms, or revelations about the meaning of life. Stop having meetings about having meetings, Prudence said. Just do things. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete it could have been packaged, gift-wrapped, and sold as a cure for noise pollution to species suffering from chronic overstimulation. Finally, a small, squeaky voice from the very back of the assembly piped up. It belonged to the delegate from Tiny Problems, Big Bureaucracy 5, a species so small and insignificant that they had been assigned seats behind a potted plant that appeared to have more official recognition than they did. But if we don't have meetings about having meetings, how will we know what meetings to have? You'll know, Prudence replied gently, when something needs doing. But how will we document that something needs doing without the proper forms? You'll remember it. But what if we forget? Then it probably wasn't that important. This logic was so alien to the assembled delegates that several of them needed medical attention. The delegate from Complication 9 actually fainted, which was impressive considering it didn't have a conventional nervous system, while the representative from Overthinking 3 began making sounds like a computer trying to divide by zero. Quilbert rallied himself for one final attempt at maintaining cosmic order and the bureaucratic traditions that had served them so poorly for so long. But surely you can see that, without proper procedures, without official recognition, without the appropriate bureaucratic framework, the entire galaxy could descend into chaos. Prudence considered this carefully, setting down her teacup and folding her hands in the way that suggested she was about to deliver a piece of wisdom that would either be completely obvious or utterly revolutionary. Well, yes, I suppose it could. But isn't it already rather chaotic? I mean, you've got 47 different species all trying to follow the same set of procedures that were written by a committee that included 3 species who communicate exclusively through interpretive dance. 2 species who exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously, at least 1 species whose concept of time runs backwards on alternate Thursdays, and a bureaucrat who was apparently having a nervous breakdown at the time. The truth of this observation hit the assembly like a freight train made of pure, uncomfortable reality, traveling at the speed of unwelcome revelation. Besides, Prudence continued, chaos isn't necessarily bad. Some of our greatest achievements have come from complete accidents. We discovered penicillin because someone forgot to clean up their laboratory. We invented the microwave oven while trying to build better radar. We created the internet because we wanted to share research and ended up with a global network of people arguing about everything imaginable while simultaneously sharing pictures of cats. She paused to take another sip of tea, letting this sink in. The point is, sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop trying so hard to solve it officially and just solve it, preferably while having a cup of tea and not forming a committee first. Bimpleton Worry-Whisk had been frantically calculating throughout this conversation, his administrative device smoking slightly from overuse. Now he looked up with the expression of someone who had just discovered that 2 plus 2 equals fish, and somehow the fish made perfect sense. Sir, if we applied their muddling through methodology to our current efficiency crisis, our productivity could theoretically increase by approximately 4,000%. Maybe more if we stopped counting productivity as number of forms processed and started counting it as actual useful things accomplished. That's impossible. Actually, Prudence interjected helpfully, we ran a small test. We took the liberty of reorganizing your filing system for Sector 7G while you were having your meeting about scheduling the meeting to discuss the filing system reorganization meeting. We hope you don't mind. The hologram shifted to show a before and after comparison. The before image showed a filing system that appeared to have been organized by a committee of caffeinated squirrels with severe attention deficit disorder and possibly some unresolved trauma. The after image showed files arranged in what appeared to be logical order, alphabetical order even, with labels that could be read without requiring a degree in advanced bureaucratic interpretation. How long did this take you? Quilbert asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. About 20 minutes, Prudence replied. Most of that was spent making tea. The filing bit was rather straightforward once we figured out that chronological by bureaucratic importance as determined by the Committee for Determining Administrative Relevance basically meant completely random. The collective gasp from the assembly was audible from 3 sectors away and registered on sensitive equipment designed to detect cosmic phenomena. "You mean files that are actually findable?" whispered the delegate from Lost Document 7, a species whose entire civilization was based on the tragic assumption that important paperwork was supposed to be impossible to locate. "Revolutionary concept, I know," Prudence replied cheerfully. "We also have some ideas about meetings that actually accomplish something. Forms that people can understand without advanced degrees in bureaucratic interpretation, and decision-making processes that take less time than continental drift." Bimpleton Worrywhisk was now scribbling notes so frantically that his writing implement was not only smoking, but was beginning to glow with the heat of bureaucratic revelation. "This is extraordinary. We could actually become efficient. People might actually be able to find things. Decisions might actually get made. More importantly," Prudence added, "you could actually help people, which, if I understand correctly, was rather the original point of having a government in the first place." This observation hit the assembly like a revelation wrapped in common sense and delivered by someone who had apparently never heard that things were supposed to be complicated for the sake of being complicated. The delegate from Remember the Original Purpose 12, a species that looked like a filing cabinet with existential regret, made a sound like distant weeping. We had forgotten. The original purpose. It was so long ago." "Oh, it's never too late to remember," Prudence said kindly. "We've found that most systems work better when people remember what they were actually trying to accomplish in the first place." "Oh." Quilbert straightened his ceremonial ribbons and made what was possibly the first executive decision of his career that didn't require a committee to approve the formation of a committee, to study the decision to form a committee, to consider the implications of making decisions. "Very well," he announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I hereby officially recognize Earth as a planet," Prudence supplied helpfully. "As a planet, with all the rights and privileges thereof, and I appoint Prudence Kettlesmith as the first ever galactic consultant for practical problem-solving." The assembly erupted in what might charitably be called applause, and less charitably be described as the sound of several dozen different species simultaneously having nervous breakdowns while trying to express approval through whatever noise-making apparatus they possessed. "Lovely," Prudence beamed, raising her teacup in what appeared to be a toast. "I'll bring biscuits to our first meeting, and perhaps some proper tea. I have a feeling we're going to need both." As the hologram began to fade, leaving behind only the lingering scent of Earl Grey and the revolutionary possibility of a universe that might, for the first time in millennia, actually get something done without requiring 17 different permits first, Quilbert found himself smiling. It was, he realized, the first time he had smiled during an official function in approximately 400 years. It felt rather nice. "Bimpleton," he said to his assistant, "cancel my next 14 meetings and find me that efficiency report. The real one. Not the report about the efficiency report." "Sir," Bimpleton replied with something that might have been enthusiasm. "For the first time in my career, I think I actually know exactly what you mean." And somewhere in a small office on a blue-green planet that had just talked its way into official existence, Prudence Kettlesmith poured herself another cup of tea and began making a list of things that could probably be fixed with a bit of common sense, some really excellent biscuits, and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, the solution to most problems wasn't more bureaucracy.